And with that, friends, we welcome you back in on a Monday morning to the One Giant podcast, where I am, of course, your host, Adam Armbrecht, flying solo today. No Andy Makowitz. We both actually took our Friday show off, had a nice extended weekend. Andy, a trip with his family to one place, me with mine to another. And ultimately, just a little bit of a reprieve from covering the Giants. And if you follow me in other places, covering the Nets as well. Before, from a New York Football Giants perspective, we get back into this lead up just over 2 weeks. It's the 12th, so we're only another 17 days, 2.5 weeks away from the big draft day that's going to be taking place in Cleveland this year, where, of course, we know the New York Football Giants have a lot on their mind. There's been some speculation, and we're going to get into it here, around who maybe now is being regarded as a fit for the New York Football Giants at number 11, whether or not the signing of Kenny Golladay is enough. And this has been a topic that we've had before, to sway Giants fans, Giants brass, Dave Gettleman, right, Joe Judge, even John Mara, away from the need for a wide receiver and potentially pushing that button there at 11. But before we do that, because I'm going to get into basically the breakdown here, a couple of quotes around the Adoree Jackson signing, both from Mara and then from some league executives regarding the contract that was given out to him. So we're going to look at that for a minute. Then we're going to switch over, talk about the Giants' perspective at 11 and some of the latest news around who they may be interested in. And then finally, though, not to gild the lily, as we like to say here, going to give you three wide receiver prospects. If you've been following the mocks, some of them, or at least one of them, is going to be familiar because I've selected him for the Giants before. But really, three wide receivers that I think fit specific needs. Going to, in the show notes after, if you're on YouTube, provide you with the links to the highlights that I was using here, so that those channels get their due credit. And set up the explanation, the information, the belief that the Giants going with a wide receiver is something that they can do in this draft, but don't necessarily need to do early on. But before we do, as we welcome you in, of course, live and visually on YouTube, I want to take a look at the Adoree Jackson signing. So recently, and I'll get this pulled up here, there was some speculation around, go back to when the signing comes in. It's a pretty big contract for a player who we think has played well. Obviously, the Pro Football Focus grade suggests that he's been a successful corner, obviously dealt with some injuries last year. But when we talk about the signing itself, first we'll hear from John Mara. It wasn't necessarily the plan coming in, speaking about free agency and who the Giants wanted to target. We knew we had some room to operate with. We knew we had some needs. We wanted to see who was going to be available. If the right opportunity presented itself, then we'll spend the money. If not, the one thing we said at the beginning of the process is we're not going to spend just for the sake of spending. It has to be the right opportunity. It has to be the right individual. So, it's interesting because when we talk about Adoree Jackson, we talk about Kenny Golladay as well as the two big signings in the free agency class for the New York Football Giants. Both of them at least came in with some level of, you want to call it off the field concerns, you can label it that way. We know Kenny Golladay and Adoree Jackson really as well, right? He comes back from his injury at the end of the year, but the speculation is he could have been back sooner. And that's a team in the Tennessee Titans who were certainly hoping to make a nice playoff run for themselves. In Kenny Galladay's case, no playoff runs for the Detroit Lions. He gets injured and doesn't come back. And the speculation is he very well could have. So throughout the interview process before giving out these contracts, we know the Giants wanted to see where these guys were at on both of those fronts. Mara goes on to say, I think in all cases, they were the right individual, so it made it a much easier decision to give the okay to go ahead and spend the money. But I can't say we came in expecting to spend $100 million or whatever the figure it was. I say it every year, just make sure it's the right guy, it's the right individual, it's the right fit. They're healthy, and we can manage the cap situation going forward, and I think we'll be able to do all of those things. So, a key takeaway there in that last quote is healthy, right? So I think we put this in the hierarchy, and you can go back to last year's draft when the Giants take a player like DeAndre Baker. The off-the-field issues rear their head, and Andy and I debated this somewhat passionately on both sides, right, at the time, about how can you draft a player like that, or in that situation, move back into the first round to take a player that has some level of flags on his resume. And not to retread it, but it wasn't that level of red flag, right? This was about his on the field acumen, his willingness to learn, his dedication to the game. Just as big a red flag as from a football standpoint, but then there's the personal side of it. So the fact that Mara mentions, obviously, the right players that make it worth it. So that means you feel comfortable with about the character piece of it. And we've heard the interviews from Jackson and from Galladay on that front. And then it's the health piece. So both these players come in, they both clear the medicals. So you have to, at least, if you trust the Giants organization and their medical staff, feel good that these players are going to be healthy and available for you throughout the remainder of this season, throughout the remainder of their contracts as well. So those two boxes get checked and you're happy with that. However, the other side of it is, as we have Mike Sando of The Athletic reported that the Jackson signing was regarded as inexcusable, questionable, and ridiculous by some executives around the league. A Dory Jackson deal was inexcusable, one executive said, and then they went and jeopardized their future cap by converting guys to get all these deals done. The potential for disaster is high. That's the first quote from another executive. Another one went on to say, what they paid was ridiculous to me, but who they got wasn't a problem. They had trouble getting receivers to go there. So the Galladay deal is kind of what happens. I don't know how they got Adoree Jackson to $13 million. Adoree is talented, but he has been hurt a lot. So they're talking about both Galladay and Adoree Jackson. In the Galladay circumstance, you're really saying you want the big receiver, you want to secure him. And we talked about this at the time of that signing, right? If you think about the idea that maybe Galladay would have preferred to reset the market, go back out there next year and test those waters. So, we say we like how he responds to questions regarding the Giants, the culture, the desire to be here, and all those things. And also the money was the ultimate bottom line for him as far as signing a multi-year deal versus going back out and trying to get a big contract next season, like we're probably going to see out there in Chicago with a guy like Allen Robinson, right? He gets franchise tagged, and at some point he's going to look to really cash in, and that contract will probably exceed what Galladay got from the New York Football Giants, regardless of what the years are, average annual. But the injury concerns around Adoree Jackson, again, we talked about this in free agency. When you look at the grades for players, and really the idea of when you have a number one like we do in Bradbury, what's the next component? You want to have a stable number two in behind them. So it becomes interesting when you think about a player like that and you say, what are the expectations for this player playing across the other side of the field? Now, he wasn't a true number one in Tennessee either, but you saw the dynamic there. If healthy, yes, big asterisk there, obviously. I don't want to say that sometimes other executives, right, following big signings, put out the smoke of, oh boy, that's a lot of money to spend on that player, because maybe they were there at $12.5 million average annual salary and Adoree Jackson didn't want to go there, right? Or they were hoping that the market wouldn't be found for him and they could maybe get him on a steal contract, maybe a Tennessee Titans executive. And that's not to say that the Giants didn't spend big money. We were all a little bit surprised at the number that Adoree Jackson received, but given his age, given his talent, big if, capital IF, if he can stay healthy and stay on the field, then you've gotten an incredibly talented player, and I think that you'll see he's worth that money. Brief pause here over on the live. What up, Joseph Clark? Good morning to you, sir. Thank you for checking in with us on our YouTube live stream, as always. So that's the big first piece for me as you work your way through. Another one, let's take a look here. I want to cover a couple of these quotes quickly before we move off into some other bigger issues, because, hey, Adoree Jackson's on our team and we're excited about him. But going into free agency, an executive said, the cap was lower and a lot of teams did not have much ammo. The longer you waited, the bigger the bargains were going to be. Adoree Jackson was late in the process. He should have been a bargain, and he wasn't. That was questionable. So we're hitting some of these tenets, and that's probably fair, right? You can make the assertion that, for example, when you think about Griffin from Seattle and then going down to Jacksonville, right? He signs a big deal, I think about $15 million average on that contract. And it makes sense because it's early in the process and you're looking to secure that player. So that's exciting. But putting out a big dollar number like that is because you don't want to risk other teams getting involved, other teams putting in their offers. For the Giants, by the time this comes up, it was almost kind of like Adoree Jackson was waiting out the market, not unlike Kenny Galladay, right? Waiting for all these other wide receiver dominoes to fall seemed to be predicated on what was Galladay going to do. And then ultimately, it's another big number for the New York Football Giants. And I think if you want to put this into a context that maybe, well, if it's palatable or not, the Giants wanted to be a better team this year, needed to be a better team this year for Daniel Jones' sake and for the franchise's sake. If you listen to John Mara, right, talking about losing patience, and we chuckled about that as far as he's lost patience a number of years, and sometimes he's been the reason that he should be losing patience because of choices that he's made. But if you're losing patience and you want to start to win, then yes, maybe you need to offer those big contracts, and it's a two-way street in the sense that you give out that money to secure that player, and you also, by giving the contract, let them know what the expectations are coming in. Again, you want to call that a little bit of fluff, you certainly can, but the Giants got two really talented free agents, and now the question becomes, are they going to perform? Are they going to be the impact players that you expect from them? We're banking that they are, and that's all that we're really concerned about. If they turn out to work, the numbers don't matter. If it turns out that Kenny Golladay gets hurt, or that Adoree Jackson is not a true number 2 cornerback or suffers injuries as well, yeah, then the numbers are going to be a little bit difficult to swallow. But the Giants had the money to spend. Remember, they wanted to go get Floyd at the linebacker position. They took a run at him. $16 million ended up being too rich, so all of a sudden you were able to look in other areas and decide. One of the things I think we covered on this is that when you go back to that moment, if you wanted Leonard Floyd, then I probably spend whatever it takes to get him, and I live with the fallout of that. No Adoree Jackson. Would it have meant possibly no Kenny Golladay? Got him down to $4.5 million on the cap hit. So that situation, I think, came down to the Giants are willing to spend big money as long as the cap hit numbers can be laid out correctly. And Floyd didn't fall into that category, goes back on a big contract and one that had balanced upfront money across the board. So that's the way that I think it works out there. We'll take a brief pause from the podcast itself and get a look over here at Joseph Clark, who didn't have a problem with the signing. They believe in him. They're not worried about re-signing him after this year. It's not like it's a 5-year contract. Yeah, 100. There you go. It'd be 100%, right? So Jackson on that 3-year deal. And listen, technically, it seems like every 3-year deal is a 2-year deal. But he's also the age range too, I think. Remember, you're talking about a guy in Bradbury who was incredible last year and is also 29, 30, and we know how cornerbacks start to drop off. So this is safeguarding that. If it works out with Adoree Jackson, he can become the next number 1. And even if he doesn't, he can still be there for another, his 3-year contract. You can bring in maybe through the draft, if not this year, next year, or look to free agency another couple seasons and bolster that unit as well. So the only thing, last footnote that I'll say on it is, you don't typically see this much money locked into your cornerback position, right? You want the true elite number 1, and then you want a quality player at that second spot. But given how poor that play was, or at least how inconsistent it was last year across from Bradbury, it makes sense that the Giants wanted to pull the trigger and just get somebody in there. We now turn our attention over to the other news, the 17 days away news. That is the NFL draft on the 29th of April. Rumor and speculation now that some people are saying the Giants may be very close to full bloom love on Devontae Smith. That he's a fit, he's dynamic, all those things. Now we've heard that Jalen Waddle is a perfect fit for the New York Football Giants at 11. We've heard that adding a wide receiver doesn't preclude them from adding another one early in the NFL draft. Now you heard Maris say, and there's a quote out there from him, that getting Kenny Golladay certainly changes when they need to go get another wide receiver, but not that they're done getting wide receivers. But again, I keep coming back to this, and we're going to get into these mock draft scenarios that we've talked about and some of the opportunities I think the Giants have. And that's really what this bulk of this episode is going to be about, is 3 wide receivers that aren't going to get their names called in the first round that I think could be incredibly valuable additions to the New York Football Giants. Mara stated that getting Kenny Golladay doesn't stop us from getting another wide receiver, but it can stop us from spending it in the first round. And when you think about still needing offensive line, and you think about still needing edge rusher, you can think about even needing linebacker, depending on how you perceive Tay Crowder or that collection of players alongside Blake Martinez, or the long-term building after Blake Martinez's contract. Will he come back on a second contract? Depends probably on what the price point ends up looking like. So again, there's the short and the long-term view about building out this roster. When you think about Devontae Smith, Again, to me, it's all relative because I had this conversation with Pessimistic Mike, and I've had this conversation dozens of times with him. He loves Jalen Waddle. And in more recent time, especially after the Galladay signing, he's backed away from just the need for a wide receiver there. Everyone starts to really love this idea of trading back and still getting value. Even if the Giants trade back in the first round, I still wouldn't go for a wide receiver. The guy that I really did love, and I've talked about, is Rashad Bateman, and he had a good pro day 40 time, obviously. He's projected to be a number one starter, big-time playmaker at the NFL level. But again, one of the interesting things, I had a conversation with Peter Bukowski, who does some work on the Locked On Network, and he was talking about from the first round to the second round, the hit percentages on some of these positions. So a couple of interesting points that he brought up that I think is worth passing along to contextualize the need at wide receiver. If you're taking an edge rusher outside basically the top 50, it's a crapshoot. There's no guarantee. You don't know what it's going to be. You should think about throwing a dart blindfolded at the board. So if you're the New York Football Giants and you do pick at 42 in the second round, and obviously you have a high first-round draft pick, you better dedicate what you have to a position of need early in this draft. Now, likewise, or I guess on the other end of the spectrum, really, for offensive line play, the hit rate in the first round is something around 62%, high in the first round of the draft. But in the second round, it's 42% success rate, almost 1 for 2, right? So the hit rate is significantly stronger going into the second round at the offensive line position than at the edge rush position. So now you start to bring out those hierarchies. And we talked a little bit, this is off to the side of an NBA conversation that I was really having with him, but we also talked a little bit about the value of wide receiver and when is the right time, the wrong time. And when you sit there and put your hierarchy, it's just, it depends on where you are as a franchise and what you're looking to accomplish and how competitive you think you can be, where the need base is, obviously. But it's really hard by Peter Bukowski's account and by my own assertion over the last, month and a half of doing the podcast here, that it's hard to say we need offensive line, edge rusher, and wide receiver. And wide receiver has the ability to push itself to the top of that list. It just is, especially after signing Kenny Galladay. Go tell me that we signed player X on the offensive line in the offseason, or that Kevin Zeitler was still on this team and starting at right guard for us this year. Yeah, that's going to shuffle the way I look at the board. But even in that case, then I'd start to look over at edge rusher and say, who's the best value? How do we get the impact player? Should it be Mekhi Parsons? Is he going to have to play on the inside first and then be able to kick to the outside eventually on third downs, short-term, long-term, right? And what's the talent pool behind him, and when can we expect that threshold to drop off? And we're seeing now, by the way, guys like Ojulari, guys like Owe, guys like Tryon that we've mentioned, right? Joseph Tryon. These guys are all starting to come up that board a little bit. So that delineation of where that talent threshold falls as you get into the second round, you're starting to see that open up a little bit. And every player that gets put into the top 50 or so, those are the guys that you can have a little bit more confidence in based on what scouts are saying. Whereas guys that are in that 60 or 70 range, you can say this could be a potential hit or miss opportunity. And then by and large, that's what the draft is. I don't buy into the idea that Devontae Smith is somehow a big target for the Giants at 11 or a dynamic, really great, strong fit, however you want to look at it. I really don't see that necessarily being the case. I think we're now into the stage where some of this stuff is going to be about how do you signal to people, to teams, that maybe you're willing to take a wide receiver, right? I'm willing to, if I'm the Giants, if I'm Dave Gettleman, I'm willing to take anybody. I'll take Parsons. I'll take Slater. I'll take Pitts, obviously. I'll take a Jalen Waddle. I'll take Devontae Smith if these guys are there. I'll take a Kwity Paye. I'll take an Ojulari. I'm willing to do anything at 11, which probably also means that I'm willing to trade back from 11. So even though we've talked about it before and what is the likelihood that Dave Gettleman would trade down, I at least think that the Giants want to present it as though it could be a possibility so that then they can field the offers. And a difference between whether you agree or disagree with Gettleman's selection of Saquon Barkley at number 2 overall, where you have quarterbacks on the board, or you have real value for teams looking to move up for a quarterback prospect potentially, there's a difference there between a lack of flexibility in moving down versus a willingness to move down at 11. You can go from 11 back to 15. You can go as far back to maybe 20 there with Chicago. You still want to keep yourself up in that range and say, we are still going to find ourselves a quality player. If the Giants had, Slater, Parsons, Ojulari, Kwity Paye, you want to say even Kyle Pitts maybe falls there, a Smith, a Waddle. You're going to have still Vera Tucker, who's maybe more of a mid-20s, Owe, all of these guys. A couple cornerbacks could fall into that range as well. Maybe another offensive lineman, depending on how you build out your board. You can sit there and say, trading back 3 picks, 4 picks, 5 picks, we're still going to get one of the top 3 or 4 players on our board overall. And what do we gain from that? We've kind of walked down this road before a little bit, but it's worth reiterating, because just because it hasn't happened under Dave Gettleman doesn't mean that it can't happen. So it does bear repeating and just putting that out there as far as what to expect or the potential to anticipate. I don't anticipate the Giants going with a wide receiver. That's just me. The best scenario for someone who wants a wide receiver is the Giants trading down if you want him in the first round, because taking a wide receiver at 11 to me is wasting the value of that selection for positional need and value of where you are on the board. But we'll see. People could say the same thing at 2 when you selected Saquon Barkley. So the case can be made, right? If Dave Gettleman, if the Giants like somebody, they're not going to worry about leaning into selecting a player like that. Now let's turn the page and let's take a look at 3 wide receivers to me. And I'm going to cover a spectrum here before I pull up. I've got a handful of highlights to run just while we're here talking. And as I said, I'll put the respective feeds into the show notes here so that those guys get the credit that they deserve, putting together these compilations on YouTube for everyone really to soak in. But here's the interesting thing that I want to talk about. So the 3 guys we're going to bring up are all second to maybe, second to third, depending on where they fall. And that's kind of where I want to start with this. Tylan Wallace, Dyami Brown, who I've mocked to the Giants before, Amon-Ra St. Brown. These are 3 guys that I like. I have a couple other bigger bodied receivers that I'm interested in as well in the later rounds, like a TJ Vasher, although some off the field issues, some dedication to football concerns, maybe move him in or out of there. And there's some other bigger bodied fellas as well, like Warren Jackson, a little bit lean. Maybe he just falls into the MAC category for us, where you're taking a look at a guy that potentially could or could not. But the interesting thing, but the interesting thing to me is go over on ESPN's big board, for example. Tylan Wallace, 10th overall wide receiver available. Dyami Brown, 15th. And Amon-Ra St. Brown, the 19th available. If you go over to Pro Football Focus's big board, you've got Tylan Wallace there, and I just want to make sure that we don't miss him. So I almost did it in the wrong order. Over there, Dyami Brown is the 46th ranked overall prospect. Overall, not just a wide receiver, overall prospect on the board. Tylan Wallace, the 81st overall prospect at the wide receiver position, and Amon-Ra St. Brown is the 104th. So, you flip-flop those 2 guys there, obviously, in that regard. And if I come back over just real quick, I want to see if it gives me the overall grades here. So 70th for Tylan Wallace on ESPN, it's a 10th overall, but he's 70th overall on their board. Dyami Brown is going to come in at 100th, and then a player like Amon-Ra St. Brown comes in at 132. So the quick broad stroke thing we can say here is, in a year when we all agree that the draft class has a lot of depth at the position, ESPN seems to be shuffling these guys down a little bit deeper in the draft. Now, the flip-flop between 30-pick selection gap between Dyami Brown and Tylan Wallace, and that's saying Tylan Wallace is 30 picks ahead of Dyami Brown on ESPN's big board, where just in terms of overall prospect, you're going to have Tylan Wallace at 81, and again, nearly 35 picks ahead of him is where Dyami Brown falls. So it's a little confusing, just in terms of where you expect these guys to go. And then really a player like Amon-Ra St. Brown, it's not crazy to think 104 to 132. You're basically saying, a 15 to 20 selection movement on a player. That's just purely predicated on who else gets taken and when the value meets for a particular team to say, hey, this is the guy we want to get there, right? What are we talking about? End of the 3rd round into some compensatory picks versus mid to maybe mid to late fourth round selection for Amon-Ra St. Brown. So between these three players, we're covering everything, depending on which board you want to use, everything from top of this, well, let's say mid second round, all the way to the back end of the fourth round. The other thing that I want to take a quick look at too, obviously, because I've used it a lot over the last couple of years, and that is Walter football, excuse me, and where they have these players. And this is just going to give you a general swath of the range that they think these players can go. So around projection, and then their overall ranking at the position. We don't find ourselves talking about one of these three players, excuse me, until we get down to, as I continue to scroll, Dyami Brown, 13th overall prospect at the wide receiver position on Walter Football, second to fourth round grade. So within that, though, you'd say, well, 2 to 4, yeah, that falls right in the wheelhouse of what we're seeing between a couple of these other sites as far as where the big boards have them. The interesting thing, though, is Tylan Wallace, 15th, so a couple positions behind him, so maybe even a little bit top potential, depending on how draft goes. Third to fourth round, though. So he doesn't get that possible second round tag. So if you want to start to blend these together, you say, seems like consensus would be Dyami Brown has real second round value for a lot of teams on a lot of big boards. Tylan Wallace is probably right there. You want to take him at the top, certainly. And then if we look to find where Amon-Ra St. Brown falls, this by Walter football standards, you're getting there into that 3 to 5 round. So he's third, maybe back end. And if he were to fall, possibly, I think you could find yourself getting a steal there, 18th overall on the board. So that being the case, let's go ahead and pull these up. And hopefully that wasn't leaning too far in there for our live viewers. But first one we're going to start off here is following the key wide receivers here, Dyami Brown. So let's get a look at Dyami Brown. I'm going to go ahead and get his tape rolling in the background. And one of the interesting things is when I was coming up and taking a look at his tape, I was surprised by, and hopefully this is running pretty clean for you, his average yards is 18, a little over 18. So he's a big, dynamic, you think deep, right? Big play opportunity. But as you work through some of these highlights here, you're seeing he's catching them on 10 to 12 yard routes. What I love about him is that he's not a huge player by any stretch of the imagination. Great little slant route from the outside. Look at the dynamic burst after the catch, right? Running away from defenders. Here again, drop back pass, big over the top opportunity, back of the end zone, great toe touch, great concentration, brings the ball in. I like Dyami Brown a lot because you're talking about a player that even, 6'1", basically 200 pounds, he can throw on a little bit of weight there as well. I think that he is a guy that's going to have versatility inside, outside, and, a little bit of that twitchiness that we like to see in some of our wide receivers. And specifically when we talk about this group of guys that we're going over, the reason why I also like them is, and they're showing that highlight, look at those toe touches right here. How good it is that he gets that both feet in at the back end there. That's pro level toe touch. Here's a stumble job, right? Both he and the cornerback stumbling still shows the balance, the focus, the concentration to bring that ball in. We'll get one more look at a highlight here before we drop this down out of the way, top of the screen there as this route combination goes. Ready? So he's going to come up there, little hand check away, and then that's the touchdown catch, right? Stumble and still regains focus, concentration, sees the ball in. Slows up, and this one is actually up on his back shoulder there and still manages to reach back to grab it here. One more look going up against BC, over the top, blows right past the defender. So that little burst ability, get off the line and get yourself out into space. I just think that he's a compact, well-built wide receiver. Sometimes you worry about the smaller guys. Great shimmy off the line there as well. And that's something that we think about when we talk about prospects, especially as you get out of the first round. Are they going to be able to get off the line, have good release? There's a nice dynamic catch down the sideline, shows the high point of that ball there, bringing it in over the middle again here. Tight coverage, strong, goes up, makes the catch, looks very fluid doing it. And then here, one more inside, little slant route up the middle, bounces off two defenders, speed to get away, and just tripped up there as he's going down the stretch. But these are the things that we want to see from a playmaker like this. And this goes into what we're going to talk about here over these next two receivers as well. I want wide receivers that have the ability to potentially shuffle up in our depth chart behind Golladay and behind Darius Slayton. And yes, as sad as it may be, in replacement of a Sterling Shepard. So the fact that Dyami Brown can work inside or outside is certainly something that we can get excited about, because it means that in the short term, he can come on the field when any receiver might need a breather and still create a dynamic offense. As we say, the ideal role through a draft, the draft network profile on him, top 3 receiver that plays both from the slot and out wide. So I like his fit into the Giants, and I also like just the way that he's constructed. A stout, well-built, strong, compact receiver that's going to be able to hold up to some of those crossing routes, some of those difficult challenges at the line of scrimmage, hand checking, etc. So I'm a fan of him, obviously, and I do put him at the top. I put him over Tylan Wallace right now, and you've seen him on a lot of these boards. If you follow my mocks, I drafted him in the second round for the Giants a couple of times, saying, hey, fans want it. The Giants do need another weapon. That I can see, but it's just not something I'm going to look at the first round for. The next player we're going to go ahead and get up here is going to be Aman-Ra St. Brown. So we're actually going to dive back to what would be the deeper one. And the reason why I want to go to him next is because let's get his film rolling a bit here and start to think about what this player is for the New York Football Giants, potentially in a fit. And I'll go ahead and get him up full screen for us here as we just take a look at what he brings to the table. Again, this is another wide receiver. When you talk about the measurables, 6'1", 195, right in that same type of range. But for my money, considered to be a prominent wide receiver for a number of offenses. I actually, by the way, was looking at Vaughn footage from USC and also was seeing Aman-Ra St. Brown. And what basically happened with consistency is even on catches for Vaughn, I was seeing what Aman-Ra St. Brown was doing. This one right over the top, a little bit of burst to blow over the coverage there. And you can say, not exactly the best coverage I've ever seen in the world by the defense here, but another drop opportunity, this one against Notre Dame. Boom. Look how he extends those hands out and plucks that ball out of the air going into the end zone, right? So a great set of hands here, gets over top quickly, and then one hand reach out, bring it into the chest, and finish the catch through the end zone. Another look, big over the top play. That's a contested ball right there. Up over the top, draped on by the cornerback, and still manages to show the concentration. Here, escape from the QB, throws into double coverage at the edge of the end zone. Aman-Ra St. Brown goes up and makes the play despite only being 6'1". So the difference between being a red zone target or a guy who can get contested catches based on size, which is a natural gift that some players are afforded, as opposed to what Aman-Ra St. Brown does. Dynamic playmaker, right? Here we see, and I'm going to bring this back here real quick before we let this get any further. This is a great example, and excuse me if it comes back a little bit deeper than it needs to. This was a fantastic look at what I liked about Aman-Ra St. Brown as he goes ahead and takes this sweep out of the backfield, plows right off of a linebacker coming down the line, then bursts through, beats players at the second level, and off to the races he goes. I would consider him to be a steal if you could get him in the 4th round. If you had to spend in the 3rd round to get him, I'd be perfectly happy with that based on what you took ahead of him in the 2 rounds prior. So this is why a player like Aman-Ra St. Brown falling, quote unquote, or being in that 3rd to 5 range should really get fans excited, because it means there is tremendous value. There is playmaker ability, and it's just a matter of checking the right boxes in rounds 1 and 2, so that when you get to a round 3, you can afford to pull the trigger. Some great bounce-off plays there as well by Aman-Ra St. Brown. Here, sweep across again, gets away from a tackler in the backfield, hand checks away 2 more, works his way up the sideline, gets the first down and more. Dynamic, quick, shifty player that I really enjoy watching on tape. And I think, again, he lined out there at wide receiver, but has the ability to be used in a number of different ways by the New York Football Giants offense if Jason Garrett is going to choose to be a dynamic, versatile offense when he gets into it. Last one before we get out the door here, and that is going to be Tylan Wallace. We want to bring up his footage and just get a sense of what we saw from him on tape. Here it is. Again, we're talking about players out in space. So you're noticing a theme here. And if you've watched some of the mock drafts that I've done where I've said a guy like Kenneth Gainwell is exciting, it's basically the reverse of that when we look at a couple of these wide receivers. Kenneth Gainwell, a running back by trade, but has been scouted to say he can get out there in the slot receiver role. Likewise for these guys, they have opportunities to line up in different positions, including the backfield or in little bubble screen sets, and give them a real opportunity to get out there in space and use some of the dynamic playmaking ability. How about that one right there? High point it. This is, again, if we go into the measurables for Tylan Wallace, 5'11", 193, the smallest of the prospects that I'm putting out there for you today. He goes up and high points that ball over top of the defender, secures the catch, and completes it all the way through for a touchdown. Last one we'll take a look at real quick here, just over the top, underthrown ball. So he waits back, adjusts to the pass, brings it in, bodies off, and is capable of taking it to the house on the back end. To show it from the other angle here, that's slowing up, using body control, using placement to give yourself the space, knowing that you have your eyes back on the ball while the DB is caught tracking you and trying to react to the plays that you're making. Contested catch over two defenders there down the right sideline. Great inside out juke before he gives himself just enough space. And again, high points the football, attacks it at its highest point to bring it down for a touchdown. And we'll take one more look here. Why not? As they're running through these highlights, over the top piece into traffic. And what I do like about him too there, as you saw, this is a guy who is capable of getting that ball at its highest point, adjusting to the catch from the quarterback, but then also getting his foot down in the ground after the reception and taking himself upfield with great quickness, with great urgency. That's what I've really liked about him as well. The bottom line about all three of these wide receivers, as we said, anywhere from the second, maybe into the fifth if you get lucky. I think Aman-Ra St. Brown, you're going to see somebody come up for him certainly. But these are three wide receivers that if you want value and you want short and long-term value, you can take one of these guys. Doesn't have to be a first rounder. Doesn't have to be the flashy name like a Waddle, like a Devontae Smith. And I'm not saying that any one of these three is the equivalent of Devontae Smith. But they can all develop and have a similar impact within a well-developed offense that highlights, utilizes, and creates space for weapons like these to accentuate what they do best. And last but not least, on Tylan Wallace, when we talk about him, he's a guy that's projected to be a starting Z receiver, so the most role-specific player. And that's why I do take a look and say, if you ask me to put these guys in a hierarchy, I would say Dyami Brown, Aman-Ra St. Brown, and then Tylan Wallace. There's some other guys that come in the later rounds. If you know and you've been following a couple of my drafts here, you may have seen me talk about a player like Jalen Darden, who comes out of North Texas and certainly isn't going to get nearly the same highlights because of the school that he's coming out of, but another twitchy player, only 5'9", only 175 pounds. I've projected him a couple of times saying, hey, third, fourth rounds, he would be someone, if he falls there, that I think would be a little bit of a steal and a gem in the draft as well. The bottom line with all this, the New York Football Giants have options at wide receiver. They don't need to be committed at 11. Signing Golladay should adjust the way that you evaluate the wide receiver class and how you look and say, tremendous depth. Let's not push the panic button if we think that we need it. And as I said time and again, the only player that you consider to be in that wide receiver category, that is Kyle Pitts. If Kyle Pitts falls there at 11, the New York Football Giants sprint to the podium and draft him, I'm going to be as excited as anybody to get him, because he is now being regarded as a generational talent, not a tight end, not a wide receiver, just a pure weapon that you are going to fall in love with, and supposed to be basically all the things that we thought Evan Ingram could have been at the time, with not nearly as high a benchmark as what Kyle Pitts is now being regarded into this draft. It's why we don't think he'll be there for us at 11, but you never know. It depends on how Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith, do they get taken ahead of a Kyle Pitts? Do other teams have different needs that you want to fulfill? Three prospects to keep an eye on here. I will try to come back in later today, break down another mock draft as things continue to develop and swirl and these big boards shift a little bit. Let's just keep refining and trying to figure out the right combination that gives us the highest value for the New York Football Giants. That includes trading back from 11, packaging picks back up into the first round, and then even in that third round at 76, there's been a lot of scenarios where tremendous value comes for the Giants by trading back 7 to 10 selections and picking up future picks. That's been something else that I've started to think about now too in these mock drafts. How do we continue to supplement ourselves for not just this year and this roster, but also next year, and how we want to build for the future? You can, of course, follow the podcast, the One Giant Podcast, wherever you get your podcast needs fulfilled. If you're enjoying the podcast, head over to iTunes, leave a 5-star review, leave a comment here on YouTube as well. Obviously, we appreciate the support that we've been seeing here as we start to ramp up our coverage on the YouTube channel. And of course, all the way through here, now 17 days away, this is what we're going to start to do a lot more of heading in, giving you a sample size of wide receivers that could look good for the New York Football Giants beyond the first round. What about edge rushers? We highlight the top of the show, first, second round. That's the target area here. So let's go ahead and see how many possible players could we feel very comfortable about drafting, whether in the first or second round. Andy Makowitz will be back in on Wednesday. We'll break down some additional positions. We'll highlight any news and notes around the New York Football Giants. And as he, that is